colleague and Vice President of Business Development at Crunchbox, Ryan Smith's joining me today. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And our other guests from Magnetic Data and our retail data scientist and official Crunchbox partner, we have Zach Pike. Zach, welcome to the live.
Yes. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
Hey, everyone that's joining us today, you're here because you are interested in how you're going to wow your retailer with insights they don't even know about. That's what we promised you on the way in, and that's what we're going to deliver over the next 30 minutes. Over the last 5 years, Ryan and I have met with 500 plus suppliers. And Ryan, what's the number one complaint we repeatedly hear from these suppliers?
My buyer never listens to me, never listens to my suggestions.
And why do we think the reason of that is?
Because you need to come to them with something that's interesting. And currently, you're not coming to them with anything that's notable.
Right. And this is, we hear this time and time again. And so how do you get your buyer to the edge of the seat? And that's what we want to share with you today. How do you get them to lean in and actually listen to what you want to share with them? Because you have really valuable insights that they've never heard before. And this is where we're going to throw over to Zach. But essentially, when you can tell your buyer something they don't know, it adds real value to the supplier-retailer relationship. And in this case, we're going to talk about knowing which stores hold your most potential. Which ones are your high-performing stores? And many suppliers can tell us what their number one store is. Several can't even tell us that. But what we want to talk about today is how you can cluster stores together. What other data sets beyond just unit sales and dollar value can you add to the data set that makes it really exciting for your buyer and for you as a supplier to understand which stores hold your most potential, how to find others that look just like it to become high performers, and which stores you should put on autopilot. Because we think if you know that, you'll change the way you spend your promotional dollars, you'll change the way you market in those stores, and you'll get a higher return on investment for the inventory that you put in there. Q&A will follow after this, so hold on to your questions, type them into the chat. While Zach talks, Ryan and I will monitor that. But right now, I'm going to throw it over to our friend and guest host, Zach Pike.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited for this conversation. I think it's going to be interesting. So feel free to stop me anytime, ask questions, butt in, interrupt me, whatever. So Doug kind of set this up, but like the whole reason we're even going down this path, like if you are a brand and you're in one large retailer, that can be 2,000 to 4,000 locations, let alone most of the brands out there, which are in like 3, 4, 5. If you're in grocery, you can hit to like 15, 20,000 locations super easy. And so that type of selling environment is utter chaos, right? You've got stores that perform really well and stores that don't perform so well. The reality is there's usually a reason for that. And that's what's been missing, like with a lot of decision-making. If you knew, well, the two questions that are on the screen, right? If you knew what's driving my sales and where are my areas of greatest opportunity, you probably could allocate resources a little bit better, right? Doug mentioned some of these: marketing dollars, merchandising approaches. If you've got a field sales team or like a field merchandising team, directing their behavior, inventory allocation, right? If I knew the answer to these two questions, I might put certain levels of inventory in certain stores because I know they're going to sell more. Okay. So that's the idea. Like that's what we're after here. And the way that we go about this, since it's so much data and there's so many different like parts and pieces of the data, we follow a 3-step process. First, we enrich all that data. We make it much smarter with data that is outside your walls. Okay, I'm going to talk about what that is. I'm actually going to show you a whole case study of a real example. Then we cluster that data. So let's say you're in 8,000 locations as an average. That's a lot of stores. What if you just had 4 types of stores to worry about? If you're in Walmart, that's 4,000 locations. What if there were really like 4 types of Walmarts? Could you make better decisions around cluster number 1 gets X amount of resources, cluster number 2 gets Y amount of resources? So that's the clustering step. We're breaking up this big crazy system into something that's manageable that I can actually make good strategic decisions around. And then what we're not going to talk about today is the forecasting piece. We probably will someday do a whole conversation just on that piece. But a big part of this is if I'm going to understand my opportunity, I need to look into the future. And that's what the forecasting is all focused on. Okay. So data enrichment. This is so cool. This is like the secret weapon to this whole process. You're taking this really long data set, like if you think about your point of sale data, all the data of the activity happening in stores, really long data set, lots of rows of data in there, and we're widening it. We are adding additional variables to that data set around the store trade areas, as well as time-based variables. And you're seeing some of those on the screen, just some categories. Imagine drawing a 3-mile radius around every store that you sell product in and pulling back things like how much money the people in the area make, how old are they married, what types of things do they spend their money on, what types of things do they spend their time on. Okay, what about the landscape? Is it a high flood risk area? Is there a lot of crime in the area? What's the weather patterns like? All kinds of stuff. Like the list, there's literally thousands of data points available for you to append to your data and us to then use for analysis and better decision making. So that's the first step. We make that base point of sale data set much smarter with additional data. Excuse me. And then the clustering steps start. So this is where we're taking that big, crazy system and segmenting it into chunks I can make decisions around. I'm not going to go into detail about these algorithms here, but the point of this is we have done this a lot of times just in the retail space. So the algorithms are pre-built for specific reasons. The one we use the most is grow and protect. Where do I have opportunity to grow? And where do I need to shore up what I've already got? That's actually in the example I'm going to show you here next. But then we've got algorithms built for like SKU, market, store expansions, allocating marketing dollars in certain ways. And then the big one, which I know everybody deals with, the supply chain, right? So where do I put inventory? When does it need to be there? And how much needs to be there? Okay. Let's talk about a real example. This is real. We've anonymized it, but this is a hose and fittings manufacturer in the home improvement space. So think stores like Lowe's, Home Depot. And when we started with them, it was the story I just went through, right? Big data set. They had all their point of sale data. Fortunately, they were a Crunchbox customer, so it was already cleaned up and ready to go. We didn't have to like go through the steps of just acquiring that data in the first place. But what you see on the screen here is what they were dealing with. Like it was just a mess. You had like stores that were performing really well and stores that weren't. And they knew like a few data points about each store, but it was impossible to make any sort of like strategic decision about groups of stores so that they could allocate resources better. They were in a situation where they were treating every location the same. Okay. And that's what a lot of people do. I treat every Walmart the same. I've got my Walmart strategy. Reality is not every Walmart is created equal. Not every Walmart has the same level of opportunity. So they knew that. So we started with the first step in that process, the enrichment step. And on the screen here, you're seeing a sampling of some of the data points that we pulled for every Lowe's location in the country. Some of the stuff I already mentioned, home values, income, the stuff you would expect, but also things like how old are the housing units in the area, right? If you're in home improvement, that's an important metric. Are they primarily new houses or are they older houses? I'm just looking through my list here, like generational populations, population growth, how much spending there is on remodeling, landscaping, stuff like that. Even competitive information. So if you're at Lowe's, how many Lowe's have a Home Depot within 2 miles? How many have a Home Depot within 5 miles, right? How many competing stores are around that Lowe's across Home Depot, Ace Hardware, Tractor Supply, like other places people can get this type of product? Unemployment rate, crime, all kinds of stuff. Okay. So we took a bunch of data that we thought would be relevant to better decision-making around this crazy mess of stores. What's going to make us smarter? The next step is that clustering step. And I'm going to give you like just the top line summary of, you're really looking at the very first step in the whole clustering process that we went through with this client. And so Lowe's is about 1,700, 1,800 locations. It's actually 4 types of stores for this customer. Okay. Cluster 3 that you see on the screen is their best performing cluster. You know what's unique about high performing stores for this customer? Again, hose and fittings manufacturer. What ended up being unique is lower household income, older homes, no population growth in the trade area, and low spending on things like landscaping and remodeling, which was the exact opposite of what they expected and what most people would expect for a high performing product in home improvement, right? High performing products in home improvement generally lean towards new home development, lots of remodeling, like lots of activity that requires people to be inside Lowe's, lots of contractors in the area doing work, all that type of stuff. That wasn't true in this case. The hypothesis at this time was, okay, well, this turns out to be maybe there's a bunch of retrofitting taking place. Again, you think hosing, fittings, lots of retrofitting in older homes are possibly taking place here. So cluster three, $21,000 a year per store revenue, 320 stores out of the 1,800. Okay. Their two bottom performing stores were cluster 2 and cluster 4, about $9,000 per store per year. Cluster 1 was the interesting one. Cluster 1 is where we thought they had the most opportunity because it had those stores have the trade area recipe, all those little attributes that we were looking at, has the trade area recipe that is conducive to higher sales, but these stores are not performing at the level we think they should be. It ended up being 843 stores, which in this client's case was about an $8 million annual opportunity. If you just push those stores up to, I think the calculation was just to get them even with cluster 3, excuse me, it was $8 million. It's about a $30 million brand. But even like, if you look at this, even if we're half wrong, even if the opportunity is only $4 million, it probably makes sense to explore it, right? So this is the point where now you start asking new questions, right? Okay, now I understand I've got this 800 stores that are underperforming from where they probably should be. The trade area I think is conducive to me doing better. Why am I not doing better? Right? So that's the next layer. Now we go into this 800, and I don't have this in the case study, but now we go into this group of 800 stores, and I start asking, okay, well, what's unique about these stores? What are the actual segments inside this 800? Because there's going to be some that are on the higher end of the spectrum, some that are on the lower end of the spectrum across all these measures. And now what activities can I do to try and move this needle, right? Is it a marketing issue? Is it a merchandising issue? Do I have competitors in the area that I don't have in other stores? There's all kinds of next layer questions that we start to tease out through the analysis, and that you as a brand start to tease out over time as you start executing in these locations, right? So if you've got a field sales team, it's a really good conversation to say, hey, in these areas of the country, we think we have a lot of opportunity. Why aren't we capturing it? What's going on, right? It's not just data. It's also the whole, subjective side of the world that helps lead us down this path. Okay. So cluster 1, that's where we're focusing our effort. Cluster 3 is my protect group. I'm doing well. I have to protect what I have, right? So whatever I'm doing there, let's make sure we're keeping that same level of support. But cluster 2 and cluster 4 are also the ones I have to make decisions around. On this, you see on the chart here, minimum level of support is what is suggested for these two clusters, because we don't think there's a lot of opportunity. So why would I treat every store in this system the same when I think cluster 1 has a lot of room for growth, cluster 3 is doing well, but probably doesn't have a lot of room for growth, at least that I know today, and cluster 2 and cluster 4 are probably never going to perform highly for me? A reasonable person would probably say, okay, cluster 2 and cluster 4, I probably need to look and see what resources I can pull away from those stores more than 500 stores. And can I allocate those resources to cluster 1? Marketing dollars, merchandising approaches, partner marketing with Lowe's, in-store stuff, right? It gives you a much smaller set to make decisions around. And then again, we segment that 800 stores into even smaller groups. So you can make, if you want to get fancy, you can go even deeper.
Hey, Zach, I think you can't see me. My camera stopped working, but moving along, I think knowing what the customers or the suppliers that Ryan and I work with, their out of stock situation is always driven by best selling stores, best selling products, not enough inventory. So I love this analysis because you can change your min max, right? So if you have a store that does very little volume, but you're supposed to put 8 on the shelf. Maybe you put 6 on the shelf. Maybe you put 4 on the shelf and reallocate that inventory to your best-selling stores, right? So it's going to limit your out of stocks. It's giving you greater sales with essentially the same initial inventory investment from the retailer. So you're not looking for any extra dollars from the retailer per se, but you're going to be able to spend that inventory capital more times per year. And it's good for the supplier and it's good for the retailer at the same time.
Totally.
So whether you can get additional facings or just find a way to get 2 more products on shelf, I think it's a big win.
Totally. And, we're constrained on time here. This is the tip of the iceberg around what you can do with this, right? So we are looking at the very first step. We're looking at growth. We haven't talked about risk. We haven't talked about like any of the other deeper stuff that you can take from this point forward. But even here, there are a lot of brands out there that don't even know this portion of the equation. Okay. So if I can hop forward one more slide here, this is the last slide on this case study. Once we've created this really smart data set, it's not like we're just doing clustering and moving on. You get to ask all types of new questions, look into the data through new lenses that were not possible for before. So like this here is that same Lowe's data, but we're looking at sales per capita. So the red dots are high sales per capita, green dots are low sales per capita. And so when you normalize for population, usually that helps you get around in the US, that helps you get around things like, oh, Texas, Florida, California are my biggest states. When you roll sales up to state, Texas, Florida, California are always the biggest because they have the most stores, they have the most people. When we draw that radius around every store and we use population to normalize sales, it tells a very different picture. And so even for this client in this map you see here, your immediate question is, well, what the heck? Why in that red portion of the country am I doing so well? What is working there? Like, is it a climate thing? Is it like we're just our field merchandising team is really hot in that area? Like there's so many questions you can start to ask on the growth side, but you can also ask it on the underperforming side. Like, okay, now I do have questions here. California, Texas, Florida, there are a lot of green stores. What's going on? Like, why are we not leveraging the population of people in those areas the way that we are in these red stores? What is different about these two equations? And now how do I share learnings across to say, okay, now in my high population area stores, I need to do X, Y, and Z to try and get them to where they need to be. Okay. So like, that's one step, right? That's one step further once you have all this stuff organized and ready to go.
Awesome.
And how do you typically communicate this to buyers? Is it through a presentation like this, or is it more dynamic? They come back to you and ask questions, things like that?
It depends very much on, and Doug, feel free to speak up, but it depends very much on like a couple things, really. I mean, it's like, one, how much data have you been bringing them in the past? Like, do you have that relationship as that you are someone who's giving them strategic insight and like helping them understand your product as well as the category and like what you should be doing? You might just have to get over that hurdle. But then it's also just like your relationship in general. Some, at least in my experience, some buyers, category managers are much more receptive and wanting this type of strategic insight versus others. Right. And if you've got a relationship like that, I can tell you with complete certainty, even on giant brands, in giant retailers, that this stuff definitely piques their interest. It definitely gets you preferential treatment because now you're looked at as an expert to them instead of a supplier, right? You're no longer the person coming and, talking about how great your product is and talking a little bit about sales and how good they are and velocity and you're having the inventory discussion. You're now coming with, hey, here's what I'm doing strategically over the next 12 months. And here's the data that led me down that path. What can we partner on here? Like, what am I doing that lines up with what you're doing? And how do we work together so that we both win?
Yeah, I think we've seen it from retailers too, just pushing back on suppliers to come to them with more data-driven decision-making, right? So we've seen, Home Depot's improve their portal, Walmart's coming out with a new portal called Luminate. And it's just essentially putting a lot more pressure on the supplier to use the data they make available to create a story that adds value to the relationship. It's
Totally.
the buyer's responsible sometimes for 500, 10,000 products. They just don't have the time or to dig deep into why this store performs well with a product. And it's just easier for them to allocate 8 to every store, and away they go. That, check box and move on to the next product.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
also important, I think, to think about the way that your buyer interacts within their business. Previously the buyer could write the check for your product, they could change things, but now they're having to sell to a committee. So if you're not preparing them with something to take to that committee, they have to do all the heavy lifting, and the chances of that happening for your product, specifically if you're the second, third ranked brand in that category, it's slim. But if you come to them with something that's useful, they can take that to that buying committee that they're reporting back to and actually get product on shelf. It's just, yeah.
And that relates to so many things. That's merchandising, that's co-branded marketing. That's like, how do I get in the FSI every week? There's all kinds of things that, yes, you're right. The buyer has stakeholders they have to convince. So if you just leave it all up to them and their own devices, that's not a winning strategy.
Yeah. They don't have the time ultimately.
Right.
Like
Right.
they just don't.
Yeah. we know the replenishment system isn't going to figure it out for them.
Yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
What do you got next for us, Zach?
If you want, we could talk about another example.
I love this one. I saw in one of your LinkedIn posts last week. This is great.
Yeah. So this is just this is Target. This is a looking at pet activity in Target. So the unique thing about this approach is it's not limited to any certain category. Okay, at the core, from like a data guy's perspective, it's all just data, and we're just like trying to find the correlations and relationships and lead us down the path for better decision making. So like what you're looking at this on the screen here is the number of Target stores ranked by average dollars spent a year on pets. Okay. So if you draw a 3-mile radius around every Target and you look at, okay, how much money do people in this trade area spend on pets? Target sells lots of different types of pet food as well as toys and, all kinds of pet stuff. So the range here, if you look at this histogram, is showing you how many each one of these bars is how many targets. So like that tallest bar there is 160 targets the people there are spending about $700 to $750 a year on their pets. That includes dog food, leashes, anything. But it ranges, right? And this is the important part about this is it's not $700 across the country. It ranges from about $450 all the way up to $1,500-$1,600. Okay. And you've got like varying number of stores in each of those categories. This is why segmentation is so important. What happens all the time is we use averages. Oh, well, on average, people spend $700. So I'm going to build my plan around $700, when in reality, some people spend $700. Some people spend $1,000. Some spend $500. And even if you just took those 3 categories, now you're exponentially smarter about how you approach the market, because obviously with our approach, we can tell you where those stores are. And I'm always looking, I'm a nerd for this stuff. So I'm always looking for like the correlating factors. What's another factor I can use to build that little recipe we talked about earlier that would tell me, oh, this trade area is a really hot trade area for us. And this one is really obvious. But like household income correlates really well, right? So the more someone makes, the more money they spend on pets. Oddly enough, that's not always the case, right? So like just because someone makes more doesn't mean they always spend more in every category. Sometimes it actually is an inverse relationship. In this case, they relate really well to each other. But what you also see here is it's really easy to break it up into 4 categories. So now I've got my entire system of Target locations broke up into one of 4 categories based on how much they spend on their pets and how much money they're making. You can, if any marketer's watching, people in the upper end of the spectrum will respond to your advertising different than people in the lower end of the spectrum. And it's probably a good idea to have a different message for those 2 types of people, right? It might even be a good idea to try and get different SKUs in different areas of the country based on who's there. Okay. This is how you start to use this stuff, even past just the conversations with your retailer. The retailer is going to love if you're going out with if you're going to the market with like a structured messaging strategy based on their system and who's in the trade areas and all that. They will eat that up and it'll help you. But I mean, that's just another like little short example, tip of the iceberg on how this can be used.
Right. As we were talking before the broadcast today, imagine now you layer in, I was suggesting like just housing stats, right? So are they
Totally.
single family homes, or is it high density condo development? In my condo
Right.
building, you can't have a dog over 30 pounds. So you don't need the double XL and extra large harness at your local pet shop or your local Target. What you do need is medium, small, extra small sizing, which typically when I go, they're sold out.
Right.
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 So just by looking at spend, now you can look at spend and you can look at, housing density. You can look at other factors that may determine what size would sell well in those markets.
Right. Totally. Totally.
Yeah. I have a few clients in the pest area. Just in the last couple of minutes, I want to pick your brains on this. I have a couple of clients who do pest control products and things like that. And do you have any kind of case studies or examples from that category or something adjacent to it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so pest, oddly enough, pest is something that I've spent several points in my career working on. And partly because it's, if you think about pests, it doesn't matter the category. We'll talk about mosquitoes because that's the example I'm thinking of, but it is highly dependent on where you are in the country, as well as climate patterns and the types of people that are out there, right? And the simple one is weather, right? So we know most pest activity is influenced by weather, especially mosquitoes. So mosquitoes love wet environments. They don't like the cold. And rainfall will actually contribute to breeding. So I had a client years ago that was getting ready to launch a new new mosquito control product. They had a product similar, but it wasn't the same. It was very, very different and targeted at a different type of customer. So their question was, hey, we're launching this new product. We're going to put an advertising campaign behind it. We're going to do a bunch of merchandising. Like, we want this to be a big splash. Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards, Walmart are all on board. It's going in there. We don't know where to spend this budget, right? Like, I can loosely say, okay, well, the South is probably a good area. The summer is probably a good time to spend it, but it wasn't like, here's the date you start. Here's the stores you put the media against. And here's when you like throttle that advertising up and down. So we pulled, of course, all their point of sale data. We looked at the sort of similar product just to get a handle on what was going on with that. We took all Home Depot and Lowe's locations. We appended this data that we talked about. In this case, we actually didn't use a lot of trade area variables. We used a few, but the majority of the data we used was weather. And we looked at temperature and precipitation. And we did an analysis first to say, to figure out the impact weather has on sales of mosquito products. And what we found is really cool. We found that if you have 2 inches of rain or more in an area, 1 to 2 weeks later, mosquitoes will start being a problem. Okay. You'll start seeing mosquito products fly off of shelves. And the reason for that is 2 inches is enough to create puddles that will stick around long enough in like parking lots and backyards and stuff. That's long enough for mosquitoes to breed and for the eggs to hatch and, them to fly off and cause problems. So then, armed with that type of insight, as well as the segmentation to say, hey, here's the stores that are most conducive to selling this product, we now had both timing and location. And not only did you have like start and end dates, you had throttle based timing. So you could say, okay, this is the rainy season in this store's trade area. Here's the date we're going to kick on our campaign, but we're going to throttle our campaign based on rainfall activity. So if I get, I can't remember the threshold we use, somewhere around 2 inches, but if I get, close to that 2-inch threshold, I'm kicking media on 6 days later, because I know people are going to start having a problem with mosquitoes. I need to be in front of them because they're walking into Home Depot and they're going to buy whatever's on the shelf. They need to be somewhat primed to be purchasing my product. And so that was it ended up being really successful. And I think they still use all the weather-based throttling today on their media. But that even helped like with initial stocking in all the stores, right? Because we knew the stores that were going to sell the most, and they could go to Home Depot and say, hey, yes, we're putting this everywhere where you have mosquito products, but in these stores, here's what's actually going to happen with sales. Like, this is why we need different levels of inventory strategically placed across the country. And this is how it lines up with our advertising campaign. And you can imagine a retailer loves that type of stuff. It pulls so much weight off of them to make a product successful. And it shows you as being a partner of, making sure you both win.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. It was useful.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. I think hopefully what we've done in the last half hour today is given the suppliers something to think about. It's about, Ryan and I get to see all the sales results from the suppliers we work with. We can see it by product. We can see it by store. And certainly anyone that's watching today, Ryan and I can help you get all your point of sale data together and work with Zach to help you create a story. But, that one question no one can ever answer for us is, why is this location my best performing store? They can tell you, the easy answer is, well, it sells the most product. But to be able to give the supplier the why it sells the most product and how you can find other stores in that retailer's network that could perform like that one, that are currently maybe underperforming, under inventoried, causing you out of stock issues, you're not spending enough merchandising or marketing dollars in those locations, adds tremendous value. So Zach, thanks for sharing your insights today and kind of the process of which you go to get into these details. One question is, how easy is this to do? Because the output looks easy, but I know bringing in, the data sets and running the analysis, it has to be quite complex.
Yeah, good question. So yes, I have that conversation a lot. And for someone who's never done it before, yeah, it's super complex. This is the reason this is what we do, right? We work with consumer goods brands in retail and we solve these types of problems. And that allows us to build all the machine learning algorithms, very specific, like everything is built for a specific purpose. But if you are someone who is like biting this off for the first time, there's a lot to think about, right? So there's technology to think about as far as managing all the data. In some cases, it's billions and billions of rows. You've got to think about, like, how do I visualize the data? What methods do I use to actually build the clusters? And that's one of the hardest pieces. If I have to build a cluster on even just 5,000 locations, there is a subjective way to do it, right? You can say, well, I'm just going to group all my stores over $100,000 in income in one group and all my stores under $70,000 in income in one group. And then the rest are going to be in the third group. But if you use machine learning, you actually figure out what the groups should be instead of what you think they should be. And that is like in the case study we started with, that ended up being extremely valuable because we found things we did not expect. And that's when the best decisions get made, is when you figure out things you didn't know, your competitors don't know, your retailer doesn't know. That's when people get really excited.
Yeah, I agree. And for those that want to get started down this path, they can reach out to myself and Ryan and Zach, and Ryan and I can help get clean point of sale data over to Zach, where he can layer in the data sets that are going to make the most sense for the analysis that needs to undertake. And the output of that is, Zach, what do they get in return at the after the study's done?
Yeah, so you get all the insight output, which typically is a series of decks for whatever objectives we're trying to accomplish, as well as some version of profile report on the segments themselves to break out, like why does this segment exist? What's all the unique things about it? All the things I would need to know to make decisions. Yep. And then typically you get the data set back. So number one, it's been cleaned and like organized differently, but you get all this great trade area based data. If we're processing weather, you get all that weather data back, so that if you've got an internal analytics team or you're doing forecasting work internally, it can be leveraged for that as well.
Awesome. And that's why we're all excited to work together and take our solution to the supplier community, because I think for the first time in a long time, with all the extra data sets that are available, the retailers making their point of sale data more readily available and a little bit more detailed, they can really begin to create a story that will get their buyer to the edge of their seat. And that really was the theme today. So thank you too for joining the broadcast. Thanks for everyone for watching. There'll be a link following this on LinkedIn. I'll host it on my YouTube channel, and you'll catch it anywhere on your podcast app when you look for the Point of Sale Data Minute. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Zach. Look forward to another session coming up soon when my camera works. See you guys.
See ya.
See you.